Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. As usual, I'm your host, Hannah Munro, Transformation Lead and Managing Director of ITAS. But with me today is somebody who's going to talk about a topic I'm rather passionate about, which is the power of storytelling in finance and how we can use data to do that. So I've brought on an expert on that exact topic. So Soufyan Hamid from the Finance Circle is with me today. So welcome, Soufyan.
Hello, Anna. Thank you for having me on the podcast today.
Brilliant. Well, very pleased to have you. So tell us a little bit about your background, how did you end up, talking all about presenting, storytelling? What was your background?
Well, the start of my career wouldn't have given me the opportunity of being a storyteller, to be honest. I have a pretty classic start. I started as an auditor at PwC, and I did that during 4 years. It was really an important step in my career, I think, but more technical than the world of storytelling. And then I moved to Deloitte, which was another step because I worked as a consultant there. I started to become more interested in the world of finance inside a company because I used to work as an interim manager there. Well, still not interested by storytelling because when you work for a big firm like Deloitte or PwC, you're sort of protected by the umbrella of the name of the company. So you don't have to make any effort to convince the people about what you're saying. And you don't have to convince them that what you're saying is true and correct. So when I moved after 5 years to a company as a finance business partner, well, it was a sort of a cultural shock because I was not protected anymore by this big name. I was an individual inside a big company. And so my data was not enough anymore to convince people. It was not enough anymore to interest people about what I was doing. So there I understood that to really have an impact on the people I was working with, I needed to work more on my communication skills. And this is especially that day when the CFO told me that basically I sucked at presenting and communicating. I was not good at it. And he just told me, yes, Soufyan, you're an expert and you're speaking to them like they are finance experts, but they are not. And so to make them interested in what you say, to make them wanting to work with you and to listen to you, you have to tell them stories. And for me, that was the first time I heard the word story in the field of finance. For me, storytelling was a sort of, sorry for the word, marketing bullshit. I just thought, yeah, it's something that you make that make things more beautiful than they are just to sell them. But then I understood that I needed to make that effort because otherwise my career wouldn't go anywhere. And so I started to follow training to give a TED talk, to be interested in public speaking, in how you create a story to give a message as an expert to non-experts. And by doing so, I developed these skills, but I didn't really find something that was concrete enough for a finance professional because what I was getting was more of a one-to-many presentation, like a TED talk or presentations that people do as a Toastmaster. But let's be honest, what you do as a finance professional is not a presentation as such. It's more the facilitation of transmitting the results in a meeting in which you'll get questions, you'll get discussions. And so storytelling in finance is not something that you do as a show. It's a bit different. You have to take the best of what you learn in presentations, public speaking, but you also have to mix it with the reality of our field. And that's what I've done. And I've done it so well that I created my own methodology that I decided to transmit today as a trainer. And this is why I decided after 7 years at Proximus to create my own company, the Finance Circle, and to train finance professionals in the area of storytelling.
So before we jump into how we develop those storytelling skills, like you obviously had a point in your career where you were sat down and told that you need to work on it. What was the differences you saw once you started implementing that new way of communicating, that those new storytelling skills? What was the impact that you had within your organization?
Well, the biggest impact, to be honest, was that people listen to me. When you are in a meeting, everybody has its computer in front of them, and so finance is definitely not the sexiest presentation you can get in a business environment. Most of the time, when there was a finance presentation in an exco or in a staff meeting, people were always doing something else, or they were just waiting for the end so that they could jump to other topics. Well, at that moment, I started to get questions during the presentations. I started to have people challenging me and challenging each other and asking themselves how they could do better. So I understood that using storytelling in that environment helped them have the financial information they needed to get decisions done. So that was the first thing I noticed. And the second thing was that since I was the visible face of finance, I was starting to get to become the go-to resource in finance for non-finance people. When there was a project, they all came to me asking for advices. How will I structure my business case? How will I make sure that this project can be profitable enough? What's the pricing that I would need to put to make sure that this initiative would be profitable enough? And so I jumped from a simple back office department to an active department in the company. And that's the power of storytelling. You become visible, you become credible just by communicating something that's normally hidden in a spreadsheet. And to make it available to people, that means that you are the one behind that. And that's the human face of finance.
And you talked a lot about how finance skills or storytelling in finance is different from storytelling or presenting in other departments. Tell us a little bit about what you see as the differences between what finance does and how finance needs to tell stories and explain the numbers versus how others use those skills.
The biggest difference I would see is the recurrence of our presentations. Like when I see data storytelling on the social networks or trainings, it's mostly one-shot analysis in which you had a task and you have to deliver the results of that task. So in that case, you can use classic storytelling structures because you can have a hook, you can have a plot, you can have a climax, and then you go to the call to actions. But in finance, most of our presentations are recurring: the monthly results, the quarterly results, the budget, the forecast. You have to respect some rules there. You can go a bit off track to make sure that you don't stay in the classic presentations in which you go through the 50 slide deck, but you have this recurrence that makes that will simply not be the same as a one-shot analysis. So each month you won't have something completely new to tell. But in that case, making sure that what you communicate that month has a link to the strategy, has a link to the budget, has a link to the previous month in which you presented already the story is what makes the biggest difference with other data stories.
So, in terms of how you'd structure, you mentioned obviously the typical storytelling structure that you would apply if you weren't necessarily telling those repeatable, recurring. How would you normally structure the conversation if you're sharing a finance data story, a recurring finance point, like a quarterly update, for instance?
Well, the structure will depend on who you have in front of you, of course. And that's the first step that you have to determine is what the audience will be. And of course, you can go for individuals and adapt to each person you will have in front of you. But I will go for something simple. When you work in finance, you have two types of audiences. You have, on the one hand, the executives, and on the other, the experts. And those will have two different approaches. For experts, it will be more academical, in which you will first show the supporting evidence of what you've done. So you will show your analysis, and it will be a sort of deductive approach. So that means that you will build up your conclusion piece by piece, so that at the end they will understand the conclusion that you will share, and that will help them to take a decision. But when you go for executives, those are busy people. They do not have the time to have a full story determined by steps. They will want you to go directly into the conclusion, and then, if you have the time, you can simply complete with the supporting evidence of your work. What has happened? What's the impact? And then what are the next steps? But they both have in common that your start should be a bit hooky. You should have a hook. And it's important because the first impression will be the most important. I mean, when you start a TV series or you start a movie, the 5 first minutes will be key. Otherwise, you will simply disconnect and you will not be paying attention anymore. And here it's the case as well. And the other thing that they have in common would be also the conclusion. And that's another difference I have with other data storytelling structure, is that, of course, you have a sort of call to action, but in our field, I would rather call it the call to options, because as a finance professionals, you will present options to either correct what has gone wrong during the month or simply surf on the positive side of the month, so that people have the options and will start the discussion. And in that case, you're not a presenter anymore. You become a facilitator that will simply provide additional information. You will provide the possible impacts on the next month, on the budget, on the forecast, and will help others determine what the best path is to continue the year, continue the strategy of the next years. And that's what the beauty is of financial storytelling, is that it's not just a one-to-many presentation. You're part of the meeting, and so you're getting a seat at the table at the time you become the facilitator.
So you mentioned the concept of a hook and a conclusion being important. So tell us a little bit about what you mean by a hook.
Well, it's not really like what we would find on social networks. Let's be honest about that. We are still in a business environment, so the goal is not to create a clickbait, but you want people to have enough so they know that they will get value out of the presentation, but not too much so that they still pay attention during the meeting. And what I do is use a framework that's called the SCQA. It's the situation, complication, question, and answer, Of course, the answer will come at the end, so you don't give everything from the start, but then you explain the situation, and it's basically putting everything into the context. So you do not start with the results of the month where this positive versus the budget. No, you already take a step by speaking about what we had in the previous month. For example, what was the situation? Do we have an issue with the budget, or are we positive versus the budget since some month? And then you speak about the complication. So you already give some tips about the problems that you encounter during the month. So they know there's going to be meat in that meal. And then you put the questions, meaning that people know that they will need an answer by the end. And so it's a good way to start the presentation because it puts everything into a business context. So not a financial one, but a business context. And then people know that by listening to you, they will most probably have an answer at the end.
And you talked about obviously two types of users, and experts and exec. Do you sort of class everybody that's in the day-to-day, everyone that isn't in the exec team, in the experts, or is there any other categories of individuals that you think about when in that sort of grouping?
Well, it's more a type of personality because I've seen in my career executives that are more classifiable in experts, meaning that they ask a lot of details. They need a lot of details to be comfortable with the figures, while you also have, let's say, operational people who work more in the day-to-day, and they are more interested in the big picture. So it will be more an individual, but of course, if you go in a meeting as a finance professional, you will mostly have mixed audiences. And so you're not able to adapt to every single person. So in that case, I would give the small tip to adapt to the highest ranked.
Figure out who's the highest person in the room and what their communication style is. It's a good tip.
There you can really focus on two types of person in a meeting. You have the highest ranked, and then you also have the person who will be under fire if your conclusions put them in the spotlight. And sometimes the spotlight will mostly be negative than positive. And so you will want to adapt to them if the message that you have to bring will challenge them. They will have to answer to that. So in that case, they will also be the point of focus.
And that's a really interesting point. You know, the concept of we're not always telling good news stories. Very often we're talking about challenging issues and circumstances, especially in this current climate. So have you got any tips or strategies for where that is the case? So when you are having to give challenging news, perhaps to a fairly broad audience, how do you manage that?
Well, the first step would be before the meeting, before the presentation. You will want to align with the people who will be challenged after the share of your conclusions. So you don't want to give bad surprises in a meeting. Of course, pre-aligning with everybody in the room is not possible and even not desirable. You will want to focus on the key people, so the people who will have to do something about it, the people who might be judged about it, and then their superiors or their managers. So, for example, if you go in an exco, the CEO will somehow have to be aware, but always after the single person who will have to answer to the questions. So in that case, the pre-alignment will be super important. And the second thing is during the meeting, you will want to share enough material so that you are not challenged about the accuracy of your work, but you will have to prove it's correct enough without being in the demonstration. So that's why it's important to bring enough data, but also enough business story behind, so that we will not focus on all the smallest figures you will see in your slides, but mostly on the broader message. And in that case, you will have to align also the delivery to that message, meaning that you cannot just be joy and smile and moving all around if the news is bad. So in that case, you will have to make sure that the delivery goes along with the message.
And I guess, how do you balance what is the right level of information to present? You talked about finding the right level, giving enough to validate the story that you're telling, but not necessarily getting into the minutiae of the detail in case it distracts from the story itself. So how do you find that balance? What's your tips around that?
Well, the right balance will have to be found even before you start your slides. So in your analysis of the month, or if you're in your analysis of the one-shot analysis you do, you will have to extract what I call the signal from the noise, meaning that you will have to use some techniques like, for example, the Pareto rule, materiality levels that we use in audit. You will have also to use the price volume mix analysis to simply ensure that what you communicate will be relevant, material, and that we can do something about it. And by simply answering these 3 points, you will notice that 60% of what you wanted to communicate first will disappear and will not make it to the slide.
So let's dig into that, because that's a really interesting point. So talk us through each of those categories and what we mean, because I've got a good idea. I might be able to guess at this stage, but let's not make any assumptions in terms of what you mean by those. So can you give us some examples of where that could play?
Well, what I just do when I speak to my students is you take a use case. We take a virtual company, and I expressly put some extra information that will not be necessary and information that will be key. And when we start from the financials, we have this tendency to go line by line and wanting to communicate everything. And that's what my students do in general. What I ask them to do is to put next to each line the business reason behind. And so you will see that if you do what I call the reverse the narrative, you will have 2 to 3 elements to communicate. Because when you use the P&L structure, for example, you will go in the revenue, in the COGS, and for the revenue, you will go to the product A, B, C, D, etc., etc. But if you put next to it the business reasons behind, you will see that everything is connected, and that's the basics of accounting. Like the revenues will not move all alone. You will have an impact on the balance sheet, on the cash flow, and then the COGS will also be influenced by the revenues. So instead of going that way, take the business reasons, and you will see that in vertical, it will have an impact on almost everything. And you will have 2 to 3 elements to communicate. And that's the biggest tip I could give, is to reverse the narrative. Do not speak about the P&L, speak about the business reasons behind.
So in your use case, when you say the business reasons that sit behind, are you talking about the changing environment they're sitting in? So the revenue's gone up by X%, and so that's had this impact on the cost of sales, the overheads, and the GP, and the net profit. Is that the way you look? So figure out what is the headline, as it were, and then bring the numbers to support that.
Exactly. That's exactly what I mean. Meaning that when you focus on what happened and the impact it has, well, you will focus more on what to communicate, and the financials will just become the consequence of what happened and not the reason.
I think that's one of the challenges is because as finance individuals, and I even though I implement software for finance, I very much think in that way. So looking at a P&L, working my way down from top to bottom, and there is a tendency, isn't it, to look at every single line that sits on there. But
Mm.
I liked your concept of thinking: is it material? You know, does that line actually impact the narrative? Does it impact the story that I'm telling? If not, is it worth even talking about?
Mm.
And you said an interesting piece earlier about discarding things that you cannot control and that you can't have an impact on. So tell us what you meant by that.
Well, the typical example I would find is accrual reversals, for example. Like, it might be material, but what is there to do about it in a business meeting? I don't really see how the CTO could have an impact on the reversal of an old provision, an old accrual that we did just because it was old. It might have a significant financial impact, but communicating it could just be under the form of an email or simply in the backup of our slides. But spending time in the story about it would just extract you from the discussion that's supposed to focus on what the company is supposed to do to get to the correct results, to get to the strategic objectives we had.
Understood. And and so I guess, you know, when you're looking at presentations that your students or people that you're working with are presenting, what are some of the big challenges that you see with how they present numbers? What are like the typical mistakes that you know that you see and you find and you go, yeah, you might want to think about that.
Well, I don't have one. I have five.
Oh,
I have.
five. Okay.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, those are issues that I had in the past, and I discovered how to solve them, and I even confirmed that with discussions I've had in the last 2 years with more than 30 CFOs who identified five main issues in finance presentations. And I would just tell it quickly. We will not spend too much time on them, but the first one is that there is no clear message people go out of the meeting with. So normally, when you go to a presentation, you should go out and say, this is what I remember. But when we present the monthly results, you have so many informations to share that people do not have one single information they need to remember. The second thing is that the presentation is not always adapted to the audience, meaning that we use too much jargon. The P&L is presented as such, meaning that 80% of the people won't understand that because they do not know how to read a P&L. So it has to be adapted to the audience. We have to remember that most people do not work in finance. The third one is that there's no use of narrative, so there's no storytelling structure. The fourth one is that our slides are terrible, that we put too much information in that. You have tables, graphs, text. And I understand it's normal because we are used to document our information. It's the basics of accounting. Every transaction must be documented and must be proved. So we want to prove that our work is correct, but that's not the goal of a visual aid like slides. And we confuse often we have a confusion between slides used as a report or slides that are used as a visual aid during your presentation. So that's the fourth. And the fifth one is the delivery as such. We are not used to speak in public. We are not trained. We do not practice even before, so that we are not ready to face people in front of us who will most probably ask questions that sometimes can be difficult. And in that case, well, you're basically what you show. So people will not trust someone that's not at ease speaking in front of them. And so those are the 5, yeah.
And there's a great 5, and I can think of lots of them, lots of questions around those 5. Maybe I should have started this podcast with one of the common mistakes, but just to pick up on a few things I found interesting. So you mentioned obviously using too much data in your presentations. So how do you find the balance between the right level of information versus data overload?
Well, it's basically simple if you use a storytelling structure, because you will want your slides to go along with your story, meaning that you will want to give a general overview in the beginning, because it's how we do, it's how 90% of the companies do. So I like to challenge things, but I'm not a revolutionary, so I don't want that everybody is starting to get slides they are not used to. But then afterwards, each slide should be reflected in your speech, meaning that if you are just used to put the graphs, a KPI sheet, a dashboard sheet, or text that will just prove that your work is done, it's always already too much. You will just want the slides that you share with your presentation to be the reflection of what you just say. There's a difference between the slides used as a report, of course, and I don't have any issue with slides used as a report as long as you don't show them, because otherwise people will read it, and if they read it, that means that they won't listen to you.
It's a bit like the concept of an appendix, isn't it, really? Is that every presentation perhaps for finance should come with an appendix, which is the backup documentation, the P&L, everything. But I think what you're saying there is that it's all about bringing to the fore the messages. And if something isn't that material, if it's irrelevant, if there's nothing that can be done about it, then it shouldn't be in those slides in the first place.
Yeah, and that's even more important, because from my experience, when we have slides, we generally have automated slides. Like we have our Excel file on the side, and we just refresh our slides and we adapt the text. And each month we change the figures to match what we have in the P&L just next to it. If there are sentences more than 10 words and more than 5 sentences in a slide, it's maybe already too much text. Our titles are always the same, but we should use headlines and not titles to make sure that people in 1 second could understand what the slide is going to be about. And so if they understand it quick, they can quickly come back to you and to listen to you.
No, absolutely. So we're rapidly running out of time, but if somebody's listening to this and going, oh, like I that some of this sounds familiar, what, if they want to improve their finance presenting skills, what are the key things that they should think about or focus on?
Well, the most important would be to work first on gathering their thoughts and making sure that what they communicate would be limited to the most important points. And the most important would be to also train it and practice it, because it's not a skill that you acquire simply by following a structure that you're given. You have to practice it, understand what is the difference between running an analysis to make sure everything is correct and running an analysis to communicate what people need. You will have 2 different approaches. One will be about accuracy, completeness, and all the assumptions that you consider important as a finance professional. And the other would be to prove a point. And so this analysis will have a hypothesis, and this hypothesis you will have to infirm or confirm. So in that case, you have this point that's the most important in storytelling, because it will be the base of what you want to communicate. So if you start from there, the rest will simply flow, because from the message, you will create your story, and from the story, you will create your slides, and from the slides, you will know how to deliver it by practicing it. So the most important will be that. But the thing is, today in companies, those who are the most used to do that are CFOs. And they are used to do that because they present to external people, internal people, different type of audiences inside a company. What the most important point for me when it comes to a finance structure in a company is that CFOs take the responsibility of cascading that storytelling mindset to their teams. Because if it's only limited to the highest audiences, like the exco, the board, or the important staff meeting, that means that the biggest part of the company who will start the initiatives, who will start the projects, who will start a business case, for example, will not be trained to the financial literacy they should. And they will not be aligned with the strategic objectives that finance ensures by the budgets, the forecasts, and the comparison every month to them. So for me, you have to make sure that at every stage of the company, a finance professional, a finance business partner, an FP&A professional, a controller will be able to communicate about financial results. And that's one of the most important responsibilities the CFO has.
And it's a great, I think, shout out, because like you say, most CFOs that I know are pretty good at presenting numbers and explaining numbers, and that's why they've got the position. But it's all about cascading that skill set down. Well, thank you so much, Soufyan, for joining me today. So if people want to learn more about yourself, about the services that the Finance Circle can offer, where is the best place to find you?
Well, you can find me on LinkedIn. Basically, I share my thoughts, I share my tips, my tricks every day there. And I did that. I've done that in the last 2 years. Or you can go to the financecircle.com, where you can see the trainings that I can give to the FP&A teams, to the finance teams, and take contact with me there. I will most probably answer as soon as I can, and we can have a chat.
Fabulous. Well, thank you so much. And for anyone that's interested, we will, of course, pop those links into the show notes. So thank you again, Soufyan, for joining me on the show today. And if you have maybe some follow-up questions, some areas that you feel like you want us to drill more into as part of the show, please, of course, do reach out to me. I'm always looking for feedback. And if you enjoyed this episode, please, of course, don't forget to review it on your podcast platform of choice. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And we'll see you next time on CFO 4.0.